Welcome to the DSO Hygienist Podcast. This podcast is for everyone in the DSO space. Whether you're a hygienist, dentist, assistant, or leader, we're here to bring you expert insights, real-world strategies, and conversations to help you thrive. I'm your host, Christine Deal, and together we'll explore how to elevate patient care, grow professionally, and navigate the ever-evolving world of DSOs. Let's get started. William J. Moorhead DMD teaches systems and strategies for overcoming the challenging issues most practice face with absenteeism, turnover, lack of adequate training, and high overhead. Dr. Moore speaks on topics related to systems management, clinical efficiency, dental technology, medical emergencies, and treating anxious patients. He practices full-time in Flemingsburg, Kentucky, and he is also co-founder of IV Sedation Training for Dentists LLC and is the founder of StreamDent software. Dr. Moorhead is a past president of the Kentucky Dental Association and has earned a fellowship from the Pierre Fauchard Academy, the International College of Dentists, and the American College of Dentists. I'd like to welcome Dr. Moorhead to the show. Welcome.
Christine, thank you for having me. It's a delight.
I am so glad you're on the program today. And usually we just get started right with the questions, so let's go. You're an expert in systems management for dental offices. So how do you define the term systems, and how does that apply in dentistry?
Systems is an organized way of making your workflow to where you have a way to hold yourself and others that are using the system accountable. So for instance, you're going about a set of tasks, and the usual way without systems is we depend on our memory and experience to remember to do everything the right way each time. But the trouble is, we're human, we're fallible, we get interrupted, we get busy, we get too much going on, we try to multitask, and ultimately we wind up dropping the same balls over and over again.
Yeah, definitely that happens. So how did you get started doing this?
It's an interesting story and a kind of a scary story. It was back in 2009. I do IV sedation in my office, moderate IV sedation. And I train other dentists to do IV sedation now. But back in 2009, I was new to it. I had done oral sedation for 9 years, pretty much knew my way around. But long story short, I had a patient in, 70 years old. I gave him a tiny dose of a sedative, as we're taught with older patients, because they're more susceptible to those sedatives. And his breathing slowed down. But I'd seen that plenty of times before, so like you're taught in basic life support, I tipped his head back and I reached for the oxygen. And I turned on the oxygen and nothing happened. We wear radios in the office. I rather angrily radioed, somebody didn't turn on the oxygen, get it on now. And in what seemed like an eternity later, it's probably 30, 45 seconds, they come back on the radio and say, "Doctor, all of the oxygen tanks are empty." Now, it worked out. I was able to give the patient a reversal agent. I was even able to keep the appointment. But that was a wake-up call. It caused me to panic. I was rattled and didn't have any checklists on what to do. I knew what to do, but I got too rattled to react promptly. And like I said, it could have been a very life-altering situation for both the patient and me. I'm thankful it wasn't, but that was the wake-up call that got me interested in doing things differently.
Wow, I can only imagine. That is just so scary. By doing these systems, what are some of the advantages to using that kind of approach?
The system has your back. Instead of a team member or even a doctor, hygienist, whoever getting blamed for something, as long as everyone's using the system, when there's a system failure, You look at the system and solve the problem. So instead of pointing fingers, you work through it and use it as a learning opportunity. And because the systems build on themselves and you continue error proofing them and finding different ways to tweak them, they're never static. They've constantly got to be revisited. But when a problem happens, you fix the system.
And systems are not just for the business side or the business office.
No. As a matter of fact, I see a lot of DSOs that feel like they have their system strong, but they haven't tackled the clinical side where all the production happens, where the good stuff, in my opinion, happens. And that's, and I'm not just talking about something life threatening like IV sedation. We wind up having to do things over, remakes, whatever, because we didn't follow a system. We followed our memory and we're fallible.
So, what are some examples of how you would apply systems in the clinical setting?
First of all, direct me. What direction do you want to go? Do you want to go hygiene? Do you want to go exam? You want to go a doctor procedure?
Why don't you do hygiene? That would be great.
Okay. Um, let's say, for example, that a hygienist is using a hygiene assistant. And there are some offices that can make that work well, especially if there's multiple operatories. There's some that are not. I'm not advocating for that, but I'm going to use that as an example. So you have a hygiene assistant that does not have a degree like a hygienist or a dentist. Many of them will have a high school degree. Same thing for the dental assistants on the doctor side. Um, Yet we as dentists and hygienists expect them to be able to perform at our level. And that's not fair unless we give them the tools. So if the hygiene assistant, let's say you've got a patient scheduled on hygiene for a new patient prophy. So in that new patient prophy, uh, there's going to be a medical history workup. There's going to be radiographs, hopefully photographs or scans. There's going to be periodontal probing. There's going to be a prophy or some sort of periotherapy as time permits, and there's going to be a doctor exam. That's a lot of little pieces of the puzzle that have to come through to be able to go well. If the hygiene assistant, for instance, is trained to be able to properly use handoffs, and we can come back to that if you're not familiar with the concept or if you want me to talk about it with the audience. But if the dental assistant is properly trained with those handoffs, then he or she can be able to make the process smooth so that uh, he or she can go over the medical history and remind me to come back and talk to you about some really cool tools for medical history updates in just a little bit. But they can go through the medical history because they've got it on their checklist. They know exactly what photographs that they're supposed to take. They can know in the medical history what follow-up questions to ask, even though they don't have a degree, if you give them the information with the system. They can then call in the hygienist, give them a handoff on what's been learned, referral source, what's important to the patient, the chief complaint, their motivating factors, obstacles that are in the way. Hygienists can perio probe with the assistant's help. Then hygienists can talk about needed periotherapy, have the doctor in. One of the other, the hygienist or the dental assistant, is giving a handoff to the doctor. All of those little things can be very smooth by using a training checklist.
I'd like that. I really like that a lot.
And then let me mention, for someone that's experienced, you don't want to slow them down with a lengthy checklist. So checklists are by design supposed to capture the key parts. And if it's repeat, and common knowledge, you don't put on the checklist, for instance, how to set up the room, except for someone that's new. I use digital checklists, so we have things that will pop open for the newbies to learn on how to clean up the room, how to turn around the room afterward, those kind of things.
I was just wondering, so we got the clinical team, the hygienist in the back. What about the business office? So I'm sure there's system in place that are good for that as well.
From the first phone call. When the phone call comes in, the business assistant might not have been in that office for 2 weeks. But what if they had systems so they knew exactly what you wanted them to say, and no matter whether the patient called for scheduling a new appointment, whether it's for a prophy or exam, whether it's for an emergency, if they're calling to schedule their next appointment, their recare, any of those scenarios, if the business assistant has at their fingertips checklists to be able to go through what needs to be said in the fewest words possible. And again, we don't want, I like the concept of scripts, but I don't like the concept of scripts. I like to have some words on the page or the digital page to be able to teach someone what needs to be said. But I don't want anyone that trains under me to sound like, do you want fries with that? You get points to help teach them and then let them run with what they know. I keep separate checklists for experienced people and admin checklists, the minimum number of things that someone that's experienced needs to know to handle each of those phone call types.
Yeah, I'm sure that's appreciated because I know as a seasoned hygienist, it's like you don't want to do the checklist for a new grad. It'd be really frustrating for somebody like me. So you have found ways to apply other business models to dentistry?
That's a good question, Christine. Yes. There are concepts like Sigma 6 lean manufacturing that have been made popular by, for instance, Toyota in Japan, to look at every step of their, for instance, with Toyota, their assembly line, and figure out where the bottlenecks are, where the capacity issues were, and be able to solve those. We can apply those same concepts to dentistry. And let me give you an example. Many offices still get their instruments out, arrange them on a tray out of a bag, and the process, they wind up taking very little time at the end of the procedure to gather them all up. They dump them in the ultrasonic. Then the time investment comes up. Sorting the instruments out if there's 2 or 3 trays in there, and the mistakes that happen with those. Then into the autoclave, and then bagged and waiting again. You can, the rate limiting step, we're talking now industry concepts, the rate limiting step in our sterilization and instrument turnaround process is the autoclave. It takes about 75 minutes to run a cycle of bagged instruments, whether they're in a bag, a cassette, whatever. If they're cassettes, it might take a larger autoclave, but the rate limiting step is about 75 minutes. If you use instrument cassettes to where when it leaves the operatory, before it leaves the operatory, the rule is you make sure that all of the instruments in there in the cassette, and the cassette of the number of instruments that the cassette will hold, every hole in the cassette has an instrument, even if you don't need it. So put an extra mirror or 2 in there so that the hygienist, the assistant, can see, okay, everything's in there, I can close it up. Once it's closed up and it goes out of the room, then there's no mixing up instruments between cassettes. Everything's going to be there. You can use an instrument washer instead of an ultrasonic that will take more time than an ultrasonic, but it's less time than the autoclave, so it doesn't matter. In the process, the number of minutes that the instruments take to go through the cycle are identical, but the amount of time of labor for a sterilization technician to spend and for the dental assistant or hygienist to turn around their room with the instruments is markedly less.
Wow, that's really interesting. So how do you get started creating systems for your office?
I teach my clients, and I won't make this thing commercial, but I own a company that has online checklists for running a dental office. Whether they're using my concept or they're making their own, I teach doctors that when they're starting out to look at your pain points, look at where the biggest problems are, and start there. And I was embarrassed back in 2021. I was lecturing at my state dental association. And on one of the evaluations, the doctor put, "This is all well and good, but you could never have time to do all this." And I had made it a non commercial presentation. I didn't show anything about digital checklists. But it smacked me in the face. I had never stopped to realize I've got to teach doctors, for instance, on the doctor clinical side. In a GP office, there's maybe 10 or 12 procedures that we do that are 90 to 95% of what we do every day. You don't have to make this work, you don't have to have checklists for everything we do. I've got that eventually. I've gotten that done eventually. I've been working on checklists for my office and for what I provide commercially for now 15, 16 years. But look at the pain points, start there. Whether clinical, whether business office, whether hygiene, whatever.
So how does anybody ever find time to do all this? I mean, you're setting up the systems. It sounds like a massive undertaking.
It can be a massive undertaking if you look at the entire elephant. I think you might have heard the expression one bite at a time. Little pieces. I started on this during the Great Recession. And when I didn't have a patient, when I had a cancellation or an open hole, I started working on them. But there's a concept that the Stephen Covey people teach on being able to look at time management and what we spend in time reacting to emergencies and urgencies, we wind up wasting a lot of time. Where if we spend things, if we plan time for things that are important but not urgent, we wind up getting ahead a lot. There's a book by an author. The book is Take the Stairs. I'm blanking out right now on the author. But he teaches in one of his concepts, long-term difficult leads to, or I'm sorry, short-term difficult leads to long-term easy. Flip side, if you flip it around and if you're doing it short-term difficult, you're going to have, or if you're going up front easy, you're always going to have the long-term difficult. So it's about planning and making your life easier.
Yeah, I love that concept. So, a lot of the listeners out there are established practitioners and they've been running their offices for years without systems. So, why would they want to change what they're doing when things seem to be fine?
Well, if they're fine, why do they wind up during a procedure having to stop a couple of times during every procedure and have someone run and get something that's not in the room? And add up how many times a day that happens, and it might wind up that you could see an extra patient in all the wasted time. And then in training new people, we have had, since the pandemic and so many people leaving dentistry, we've had to train so many people. DSOs understand this way better than anyone in dentistry. And with all of the training that we have to do, using systems can make it very practical to bring someone new that has no experience in dentistry and get them up to speed quickly. And to give you a really good carrot to dangle out in front of you, I can routinely take someone that has no prior experience in dentistry, whether it's in the business office or on the clinical side. Now, I'm not talking about hygiene that requires a license. I'm not talking about a dentist that requires a license. I'm talking about the auxiliaries, the assistants, the hygiene assistants, the business assistants. I can routinely take some with no experience in dentistry and have them at the competent stage where they can do it on their own or look it up on their own with the systems in 6 weeks instead of 6 months.
Wow, that's invaluable.
And I've done it over and over.
Well, this has been such a great talk today, Dr. Moorhead. If people would like to get in touch with you because you've got these great systems that they can use, how do they get in touch with you?
If they want to look at digital ways to do checklists, they can look at www.StreamDent, that's like streamlined dentistry, StreamDent.com. My speaker website, my last name Moorhead is spelled a little differently. It's www.drmoorhead.com. I'm sure Christine will have that in some notes that you can get at. And my email address is dr.m, as in Dr. Moorhead, at streamdent.com. Phone number, Google Voice that rings my office and my cell, 502-509-1570.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the DSO Hygienist podcast today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me, Christine. It has been a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the DSO Hygienist podcast. Please follow or subscribe to be alerted of new episodes.